We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
You're listening to Carousel Sniper Victim, a Dead Glass Design production, with your host, Sean Jeffrey.
Perth, the capital city of Western Australia, sits where the Swan River meets the southwest. Sandy beaches line its suburbs, and the huge Riverside Kings Park and Botanic Garden offer sweeping views of the city. The human history of the Western Australian region commenced between 40,000 and 60,000 years ago with the arrival of Indigenous Australians on the northwest coast. The first inhabitants expanded the range of their settlement to the east and south of the continent. Aboriginal people have inhabited the region of Western Australia, where Perth is now located, for at least 38,000 years, as evidenced by archaeological remains at the Upper Swan region, which is about 15 minutes from where I am recording now. The Noongar People occupied the southwest corner of Western Australia and lived as hunter-gatherers. The wetlands on the Swan coastal plain were particularly important to them, both spiritually and as a source of food. The first recorded European contact was in 1616, when Dutch explorer Dirk Hartog landed on the west coast. Hartog set sail in January 1616 in the company of several other ships, but became separated from them in a storm, and arrived independently at the Cape of Good Hope, later to become the site of Cape Town, South Africa. Hartog then set off across the Indian Ocean for Batavia, present-day Jakarta, utilising, or perhaps blown off course by, the strong westerly winds known as the quote, Roaring Forties, which had been earlier noted by the Dutch navigator Hendrik Brouwer as enabling a quicker route to Java. On the 25th of October 1616, at approximately 26 degrees latitude south, Hartog and his crew came unexpectedly upon, quote, various islands which were, however, found uninhabited. He made landfall at an island off the coast of Shark Bay, Western Australia, which is now called Dirk Hartog Island, after him. His was the second recorded European expedition to land on the Australian continent, having been preceded by Willem Janszoon in 1606, but the first to do so on the western coastline. Hartog spent 3 days examining the coast and nearby islands. He affixed a pewter plate to a post, now known as the Hartog Plate, on which he scratched a record of his visit to the island. The first documented sighting of the region of Western Australia that we now know as Perth was made by Dutch captain Willem de Vlaming and his crew on the 10th of January 1697. De Vlaming joined the Dutch East India Company in 1688 and made his first voyage to Batavia in the same year. Following a second voyage in 1694, he was asked, on request of Nicholas Whitson, to mount an expedition to search for the Ridderschap von Holland, a Dutch East India Company capital ship that was lost with 325 passengers and crew on its way to Batavia in 1694. Officials believed it may have run aground on the west coast of Terra Australis, the western coast of the Australian continent. In 1696, Willem de Vlaming commanded the rescue mission to Australia's west coast to look for the survivors of the Ridderschap von Holland. There were 3 ships under his command. On the 29th of December 1696, de Vlaming's party landed on Rottnest Island. He saw a giant jarrah, numerous quokkas, a native marsupial, and thinking they were large rats, he named the island Rat's Nest, or Ratten Nest in Dutch, after the marsupials. He afterwards wrote of it in his journal, quote, I had great pleasure in admiring this island, which is very attractive. and where it seems to me that nature has denied nothing to make it pleasurable beyond all islands I've ever seen, being very well provided for man's well-being, with timber, stone and lime for building him houses. There is plentiful salt, and the coast is full of fish. Birds make themselves heard with pleasant song in the scented groves. So I believe that of the many people who seek to make themselves happy, there are many who would scorn the fortunes of our country for the choice of this one here, which would seem a paradise on earth." End quote. On the 10th of January 1697, he ventured up the Swan River. He and his crew are believed to have been the first Europeans to do so. They are also assumed to be the first Europeans to see black swans, and de Vlaming named the Swan River after the large number of them that they observed there. The crew split into 3 parties, hoping to catch an Aborigine, but about 5 days later they gave up on their quest to catch a, quote, Southlander. On the 4th of February 1697, he landed at Dirk Hartog Island, Western Australia, and replaced the pewter plate left by Dirk Hartog in 1616 with a new one that bore a record of both of the Dutch sea captains' visits. The original plate is now preserved in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Although many expeditions visited the coast during the next 200 years, there was no lasting attempt at an establishment of a permanent settlement until December 1826, when an expedition on behalf of the New South Wales colonial government, led by Major Edmund Lockyer, landed at King George Sound. On the 21st of January 1827, Lockyer formally took possession of the western third of the continent of Australia for the British Crown. Perth was founded by Captain James Stirling in 1829 as the administrative centre of the Swan River colony. The city is named after Perth, Scotland, due to the influence of Sir George Murray, Member of Parliament for Perthshire and Secretary of State for War and the Colonies. Although the colony of New South Wales had established a convict-supported settlement at King George's Sound, later to be known as Albany, on the south coast of Western Australia in 1826, in response to rumours that the area would be annexed by France, Perth was the first full-scale settlement by Europeans in the western third of the continent. Beginning in 1831, hostile encounters between the British settlers and the Noongar people increased considerably as the colony's population grew in the southern part of the region. The hostile encounters between the two groups of people resulted in a number of events, including the Bluff, Forest River, Flying Foam, and Pinjara Massacres. Little information exists about the exact nature of the events that took place at the Bluff Massacre. Bluff is a cattle station 140 kilometres south of Derby and 75 kilometres southwest of Yarmadanga. Responding to the brutality of the white station manager, some local men gave him a beating. In reprisal, an armed mob, which included officials and residents, rounded up a large number of the Aboriginal men, women and children, who were then shot and the bodies were burned. One account states that 300 or 400 people were killed and that only 3 survived, although numbers and accounts vary wildly. It is still a controversial topic as mining companies and descendants from the survivors battle for land titles in the region. As well as the Bluff massacre, the Forest River and Flying Foam massacres are disputed in their exact numbers of Aborigines killed. Estimates ranging between 15 and 150 dead in a series of separate encounters. However, the Pinjara Massacre is a well-documented encounter, although numbers still vary greatly. The Pinjara Massacre was an attack that occurred at Pinjara, Western Australia, on a group of up to 80 Noongar people by a detachment of 25 soldiers, police and settlers led by Governor James Stirling in 1834. Responding to pressure from the increasingly nervous settlers and against previous efforts in which he had advocated tolerance when dealing with conflicts between the settlers and the natives, Governor Stirling assembled a party of 25 soldiers. The party included Stirling himself, John Septimus Roe and Thomas Peel. This mobilisation was largely in response to an attack by Aboriginals on the property of Thomas Peel. The arrival of Thomas Peel and his settlement at the mouth of the Murray River had displaced many of the indigenous inhabitants from an important food source, as the effect of white settlement on the Pinjara lands at the time were quite considerable. On the 24th of April, 1834, an Indigenous Australian by the name of Caliute, some people have different versions of how his name's pronounced, but that's how I'm going to pronounce it, Caliute, who some settlers would call a quote, Aboriginal resistance leader, led a raid of 20 to 30 men and women on Shenton's Mill in South Perth, where they stole half a ton of flour. It is speculated that the increased tensions in the area were related to a dispute a few months before between the Pinjara People and Noongars of the Swan River area. Loss of white settlers' livestock by the Aborigines' dogs and the killing of kangaroo by settlers may have also raised tensions between the groups. Following the raid on Shenton's Mill, and at the prompting of Thomas Peel, who was the major white landholder taking land in the Murray district, in which Caliute's people generally lived, a party of soldiers, led by Captain Ellis, searched for and captured Caliute and two other Pinjara named Yidong and Monang. All three were seriously injured during the capture, but still brought back to Perth, where they were publicly flogged. Caliute received 60 lashes and was then confined until the 10th of June, 1834. In July, a few weeks after his release, a group including Caliute and Yidong raided Peel's property near Mandurah, killing a young servant of Peel's, Private Hugh Nesbitt, and injuring former Sergeant Edward Barron. Although spontaneous incidents had occurred previously, this was the first time that a settler, friendly to the natives, had been lured into the bush and supposedly murdered. Caliute's motives was apparently in retaliation for his harsh treatment at the hands of authorities in Perth. These events would be the straw that broke the camel's back for Governor Stirling. Stirling wanted a quote, decisive action that would end the attacks once and for all. Stirling had wanted to begin the expedition south on the 17th of October, but a man, known to be from the Murray region but seen in Perth, was suspected of being a spy for Caliute, and so the expedition was delayed by 1 week. On the morning of Saturday, the 25th of October, Stirling and Rowe left Perth and travelled southwards to the Preston Ferry. There, waiting for surveyor George Smith and Corporal Delmage, who had brought supplies south by boat from Perth. Spare horses from the ferry were loaded with supplies as the party set off to Hamilton Hill, skirting Fremantle to the east. There they were joined by Captain Ellis and the 5 mounted police, Superintendent Richard Mears and his son Seymour. They then rode south to Thomas Peel's property, where they were joined by Mr. Peel and 2 others. On the morning of the 27th of October, 10 soldiers of the 21st Regiment, 2 corporals and 8 privates, arrived at Peel's homestead to join the party. Ammunition was issued to the party on the 27th of October, 1834, and they were issued with several weeks' supplies, as the soldiers were to remain at Pinjara and establish the planned garrison there. Leaving Peel's farm, they crossed the Serpentine River and went forward to the Murray Delta, where tracks of a sizable group of Aboriginal men, women, and children were discovered heading towards Pinjara. In the late afternoon, they camped at Ginjanuk, 10 miles from the mouth of the Murray River, so that they could begin the attack early next morning, when they judged the Aboriginal group would be least prepared. The group was awoken 2 hours before dawn on the 28th of October, and ate breakfast in the dark. By 8 AM, the party had rejoined the Murray, where the river was 30 metres wide, between steep red loam banks, continuing northwards to cross the Oakley Brook at about 8:35 AM. Peel approached along the western bank of the river and returned to tell of a settlement of about 20 bark, beehive-shaped mia-mias. A mia-mia, or a mia-mia, is a temporary shelter made of bark, branches, leaves, and grass. The weather broke, and it started to rain heavily, as Captain Ellis, Mr. Norcott, and 3 of the police attacked from the south. The Aboriginal men gathered up their spears and woomeras as the women and children fled towards the river, where Captain Sterling, Captain Mears, Thomas Peel, and 12 others were waiting in hiding. Ellis was soon in a melee with the Noongars, and Norkett, recognising a troublemaker called Noonar, shot him with his double-barrelled shotgun, causing the first casualty. 5 or more Aboriginal people were killed in the first charge, and the remainder of the Aboriginal group then turned and ran towards the river, intending to cross and scatter into the hills. One of the eldest women in the tribe, Tilak, was shot dead with her 4-year-old daughter screaming violently. There are conflicting reports in regards to whether or not at least 13 other children and women were then shot, with both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people claiming that this may have happened. Sterling, hearing the shots, reacted quickly. Rowe was sent with 4 others to prevent the group escaping south and guard the pack horses by the ford. The governor and 14 others in a line abreast then ambushed the surprised Aborigines who had tried to cross the river. Ellis had been dislodged from his horse, but Norkett continued pushing the group into the river, where they were caught in a withering crossfire. The flood-scoured slopes gave the men, women and children little cover as they tried to hide behind what logs or bushes there were. Many ducked into the water, holding their breath as long as they could. Some tried to float downstream, out of range, but the water was too shallow to permit their escape. They too were shot. Rowe's journal quotes, "Very few wounded were suffered to escape." Soldiers fired indiscriminately at those caught in the ambush, and when all had been slain, the posse remounted to chase the others who had fled north into the bush. By 10:05 AM, it was all over. Because of the serious condition of 2 of the European wounded, Sterling decided to return immediately to Mandurah. On the settlers' side, Corporal Heffron was wounded in the arm, but recovered later to take part in the Baladong Aboriginal massacres in the York area. Captain Ellis was suffering concussion, either from a glancing blow from a spear or from the fall of his horse. He later died on 11th of November after having been in a coma for 2 weeks. A folk ballad, The Jackets of Green, honouring Ellis, was later composed and sung around Guildford and Perth taverns. On the Aboriginal side, there are conflicting reports. 60 to 70 Aboriginal men, women and children in the camp had been subjected to intensive fire of 24 guns for over an hour, and for another half hour the survivors were hunted through the bush. No male prisoners were taken alive, and all wounded were immediately shot. At the end of hostilities, 8 women and a few children were taken as captives. In his report, Sterling claimed 15 Aboriginal men had been killed. Rowe estimated the dead at 15 to 20, but these numbers don't seem to have included the women and children. Captain Daniel, whom Sterling later sent to survey the site of the incident, implied that many more were killed than officially acknowledged, as he found several mass graves, but the rain and his fear of an attack made exhuming the bodies for an official account impossible. Francis Armstrong and Thomas Peel later attempted an official count by interviewing the Aborigines Ninda and Colling who had been present. Some 11 names were given, but in view of the prohibition in Noongar culture against speaking of the dead, their task was too almost impossible. Among the dead were Unia, Caliute's youngest son, and Gummel, who had been flogged for his part in the earlier attack on Shenton Mill. 2 of Caliute's wives were amongst the wounded. Yornup's lower leg had been shot away, and Mindit had been shot in the left arm and right thigh. However, Caliute, Yidong, and a number of others avoided capture during the incident, and had apparently escaped towards Lake Clifton. Little is known of Caliute's later life, but in May 1840 his group attacked a Noongar camp near Perth, spearing 5 people. There are no other records of Caliute, and it is believed that he died naturally at an old age. Prior to the events of the Pinjara Massacre, on June 1st, 1833, Charles McFall, then editor of the Perth Gazette, had written, largely in response to unassociated raids by another Aboriginal leader, Yagan, quote, "Although we have ever been the advocates of a humane and conciliatory line of procedure, This unprovoked attack must not be allowed to pass over without the infliction of the severest chastisement, and we cordially invite and join our brother colonists to the one universal call for a summary and fearful example. We feel and know from experience that to punish with severity the perpetrators of these atrocities will be found in the end to be an act of the greatest kindness and humanity." End quote. It is believed he is referring to Yagan and the attacks he had perpetrated earlier. Yagan was an Indigenous Australian warrior from the Noongar people. He played a key part in the early resistance to British colonial settlement and rule in the area surrounding what is now Perth, Western Australia. Yagan is thought to have been born around 1795. His father was Midjuguru, an elder of the Pinjara people. His mother was presumably one of Midjuguru's two wives. Yagan's father was executed by firing squad and without trial under the authority of Lieutenant Governor Frederick Irwin in 1833, who was the cousin of now Governor James Stirling, while Stirling was away on business in the south of the region. Yagan was pursued by the local authorities after he killed a servant of Archibald Butler in an act of retaliation. The governor offered a bounty for Yagan's capture, dead or alive. Late in May, George Fletcher Moore reported seeing Yagan on his property and spoke with him. Yagan asked Moore whether Midjuguru was dead or alive. Moore gave no reply, but a servant answered that Midjuguru was a prisoner on Karnak Island. Yagan warned, quote, "White man shoot Midjuguru, Yagan kill 3. Moore reported the encounter, but made no attempt to restrain Yagan. He later wrote, quote, "The truth is, everyone wishes him taken, but no one likes to be the captor. There is something in his daring which one is forced to admire." On the 11th of July, 1833, two teenage brothers named William and James Keats were herding cattle along the Swan River north of Guildford when a group of Noongar, including Yagan, approached while en route to collect flour rations. The Keats brothers suggested Yagan remain with them to avoid arrest. While he was staying with them, during the morning, the brothers decided to kill Yagan and claim the reward. When the natives were ready to depart, the Keats took their last opportunity. William Keats shot Yagan, and James shot Hegan, another native, in the act of throwing his spear. The brothers ran away, but other Noongar overtook William and speared him to death. James escaped by swimming down the river. Shortly afterward, he returned with a party of armed settlers from a nearby estate. When the party of settlers arrived, they found Yagan dead and Hegan dying. Quote, "Hegan was groaning, and his brains were partly out when the party came, and whether humanity or brutality, a man put a gun to his head and blew it to pieces." End quote. The settlers cut Yagan's head from his body and skinned his back to obtain his tribal markings as a trophy. Later, an official sent it to London, where it was exhibited as a, quote, "anthropological curiosity," and eventually given to a museum in Liverpool. The head remained in storage for more than a century before being buried with other remains in an unmarked grave in Liverpool in 1964. Over the years, the Noongar asked for repatriation of the head, both for religious reasons and because of Yagan's traditional stature. The burial site was identified in 1993. Officials exhumed the head 4 years later and repatriated it to Australia. After years of debate within the Noongar community on the appropriate final resting place, Yagan's head was buried in a traditional ceremony in the Swan Valley in July 2010, 177 years after his death. Yagan's execution features in Australian history as a symbol of the unjust and sometimes brutal treatment of the Indigenous people of Australia by colonial settlers. He is considered a hero by the Noongar people. The racial relations between the Noongar people and the European settlers were obviously strained due to these events. After the events of the Pinjara Massacre and the execution of Yagan's father, Midjaguru, Sterling gave the Noongar people a terrifying warning. If there were any retaliatory payback killings from the Pinjara or local people, he declared, quote, "Not one would be allowed to remain alive on this side of the mountains." In the year 1850, Western Australia was open to convicts at the request of farming and business people looking for convict labour. Using that convict labour, Fremantle Prison would be constructed. Fremantle Prison is a former Australian prison and now World Heritage listed site in Fremantle, Western Australia. The 6-hectare or 15-acre site includes the prison cell blocks, gatehouse, perimeter walls, cottages, and tunnels. Initially known as the Convict Establishment, or just the Establishment, Fremantle Prison was constructed over a period of 8 years. It was built on a land grant of about 36 acres, 15 hectares, from limestone quarried on site. A 15-foot or 4.6 metre tall boundary wall encloses the prison grounds, with a gatehouse in the centre of the western wall facing the terrace. Other roads bounding the site are Knutsford Street to the north, Hampton Road to the east, and Fothergill Street to the south. Cottages which house prison workers and officials are located outside the wall, either side of the gatehouse. Inside the walls, the parade ground is located east of the gatehouse. Beyond it is the main cell block, at the centre of the site, which contains 2 chapels. North of the main block is New Division, and west of that, in the northwestern corner, is the former women's prison, previously the cookhouse, bakehouse, and laundry. A system of underground tunnels, constructed to provide fresh water from an aquifer, runs under the eastern edge of the site. In the convict era, misbehaving prisoners were punished with flogging, solitary confinement, and working in chain gangs at gunpoint. Particularly difficult prisoners were put to work hand-pumping groundwater into the prison's reservoir, known as cranking. As soon as Fremantle Prison came under local control in 1886, a refractory block with gallows was planned. It was completed in 1888 and first used in 1889 to execute a convicted murderer, Jimmy Long, a Malayan man. The Gallows Room was the only lawful place of execution in Western Australia between 1888 and 1984. From the day of sentencing to death, prisoners were kept in a concrete floored cell in New Division. They were vigilantly observed to prevent them escaping their sentence through suicide. With hangings taking place on Monday mornings at 8 AM, condemned prisoners were woken 3 hours earlier and provided with a last meal, shower, and clean clothes. Afterwards, handcuffed, they were moved to a holding cell, or quote, condemned cell, nearby the gallows, and allowed a couple of sips of brandy to calm their nerves. Shortly before 8 AM, they were hooded, led up to the execution chamber, which could hold as many as 11 witnesses, stood over the trapdoor, had a noose put around their neck, and were hanged by dropping through the opening trapdoor. After medical examination, the deceased was removed for burial. At least 43 men and 1 woman were hanged in this period. Martha Rendell was the only woman to be hanged at Fremantle Prison in 1909. Martha Rendell was the last woman to be hanged in Western Australia. She was convicted of murdering her de facto husband's son, Arthur Morris, in 1908. She was also suspected of killing his 2 daughters, Annie and Olive, by swabbing their throats with hydrochloric acid. Although the children died slow and agonising deaths, they had been treated by a number of doctors during their illness. only one of whom expressed any doubts about their deaths. Martha Rendell moved in with Thomas Nichols Morris after he had separated from his wife. Morris had custody of his 4 children at the time. Martha Rendell, who had known Morris whilst in Adelaide and had followed him west, moved into the house and posed as his wife. The children were told to call her Mother. Martha Rendell brutally abused Morris's children, once beating Annie so savagely that she could not walk. Arresting officer Inspector Harry Mann said, "She delighted in seeing her victims writhe in agony, and from it derived sexual satisfaction." Martha Rendell killed 7-year-old Annie first. Her method was to put something in the child's food that would result in a sore throat. It was alleged that she killed the children by swabbing hydrochloric acid on the backs of their throats, claiming it was medicine to treat the sore throat which she had earlier induced. This would inflame the throat until the child could no longer eat, and thus would starve to death. Annie died on the 28th of July, 1907. Dr. Cuthbert issued a certificate stating the cause of death was diphtheria. After killing Annie, she turned her attention to Olive, aged 5. Olive died on the 6th of October, 1907, and again Cuthbert issued a certificate stating the cause of death was diphtheria. In the winter of 1908, Rendell tried the same method on Arthur, the 3rd son and youngest child still alive. Arthur, who was 14, took longer to succumb to the treatment, finally dying on the 6th of October, 1908. Cuthbert asked permission for an autopsy. Rendell said she wanted to be present during the investigation. She stood by as the autopsy was performed, and the doctor found nothing to incriminate her. In April 1909, she turned her attention to the 2nd son, George. It didn't take long for the 2nd son to complain of a sore throat after drinking a cup of tea. Neighbours inquired as to the boy's whereabouts. However, his father, Thomas Morris, stated that he did not know. Neighbours went to the police, and Inspector Harry Mann conducted inquiries. Mann heard repeated references to the children's having their throats painted and Rendell's apparent indifference to their pain. One neighbour claimed he often peeked in the windows to see Rendell standing in front of the screaming victim, rocking back and forth as if in ecstasy. Some also claimed to have witnessed her masturbating. Mann located George Morris, who had claimed to have run away because his stepmother had killed his siblings and was trying to poison him with spirits of salts, also known as hydrochloric acid. The inquiry was hampered by the period of time that had elapsed since the deaths, and because the doctors could not say what effect swabbing with spirit of salts would have. Suspicions were further aroused when it was shown that Rendell had purchased large quantities of spirits of salts during the period of the children's illnesses, but none since the last death. Armed with this information, the detectives obtained permission to exhume the bodies, and this was done on the 3rd of July, 1909. Police exhumed the bodies of the 3 children. Diluted hydrochloric acid was found on the throat tissue. Martha Rendell and Thomas Morris were both charged with murder, the former being sentenced to death by hanging. Rendell protested her innocence, maintaining that she was treating the children for diphtheria. Although Thomas Morris was also charged with the murders, he was acquitted. It was believed that, although he had purchased the spirit of salts, he had not been aware of the crimes until after the children's deaths. The jury wanted to find him guilty of being an accessory after the fact, but this was not allowed. Rendell's crimes aroused considerable public outrage at the time. The press portrayed her as a scarlet woman and wicked stepmother. Martha Rendell was the last woman executed in the state of Western Australia. She was hanged at Fremantle Prison on the 6th of October, 1909. An illusion appears on one of the Fremantle Prison windows, which can only be seen on the outside of the window when inside the church, looking out. The glass is smooth and even, with no unusual shape or texture. An example of pareidolia. Urban legend has it that this illusion is the portrait of Martha Rendell, who watches over the prison. She is buried at Fremantle Cemetery, plot 409, in the same grave where another person, serial killer Edgar Cook, was interred more than half a century later. Edgar Cook was born on 25th of February 1931 in Victoria Park, a suburb of Perth, and was the eldest of 3 children. Cook was born into an unhappy, violent family. His parents married solely because his mother, Christine, was pregnant with him, and his alcoholic father, Vivian, beat him frequently, especially when the boy tried to protect his mother from the elder Cook's drunken rages. Christine Cook would sleep in the staff room at her job in the Como Hotel to avoid the beatings. Much like his mother, Cook would hide underneath the house or roam neighbouring streets just to escape a night of his father's violence. Cook was placed into orphanages or foster homes on numerous occasions. Cook was frequently hospitalised for head injuries and had suspected brain damage because of his accident proneness. Later, it was questioned whether this was due to repressed suicidal tendencies. He also suffered from recurrent headaches and was once admitted to an asylum. His reported blackouts later stopped after an operation in 1949. Cook was born with a hair lip and a cleft palate, for which he had one operation when he was 3 months old and another when he was 3.5 years of age. Surgical operations to repair the deformities were not totally successful and left him with a slight facial deformity. He spoke in a mumble. These handicaps made him the target of bullying at school. Cook's disfigurements made him ashamed, shy, and emotionally unstable at a young age due to the beatings and bullying that came with it. Though very good at subjects that required retentive memory and manual dexterity, Cook was expelled from Subiaco School for stealing money from a teacher's purse at the age of 6. Once he was transferred to Newcastle Street's infant school, Cook was again the butt of many jokes with his mumbling and scar. He continued to be made fun of at every school he attended, including Highgate Primary School, Forest Street Primary School, and Newcastle Street Junior Technical School. He left school at age 14 to work as a delivery boy for Central Provision Stores. In order to support the family, he would give his weekly wages to his mother, who could not fully support the family with the money she earned from cooking and cleaning. Many of Cook's jobs put him in the hospital due to his accident proneness. At a job in the factory of Harris, Scarf and Sandover, Cook landed in the hospital due to effects of being struck on the nose by a winch. At the age of 16, he worked as a hammer boy in the blacksmith section of the workshop at Midland Junction, where he always signed his lunch bag, Al Capone. He ended up burning his face with steam and suffering second-degree burns. At the same job, he jarred his right hand and also his thumb on his other hand. As a teenager, starting at 17, Cook spent his nights involved in petty crimes and vandalism. He would later serve 18 months in jail for burning down a church after he was rejected in a choir audition. During his later teenage years, Cook would sneak into houses and steal whatever he found valuable. These crimes escalated to damaging clothing and furniture in acts of vengeance. He would cut out newspaper accounts of his crimes to impress his acquaintances in an attempt to gain friends. At Cook's grandmother's house on the 12th of March 1949, police finally caught up with the young vandal, finding evidence at his house. His fingerprints were then matched to those found in other open cases. At the age of 18, on the 24th of May 1949, Cook was sentenced to 3 years in prison after being arrested for arson and vandalism by Detective Burrows, who considered the boy, quote, one of life's unfortunates. He was convicted on 2 charges of stealing, 7 of breaking and entering, and 4 of arson. He left many fingerprints and easy clues for detectives, which would teach him to be more careful in his future crimes. At the age of 21, Cook joined the regular Australian Army, but was discharged 3 months later after it was discovered that before enlistment he had had a juvenile record. During his training, he was quickly promoted to Lance Corporal and was taught to handle firearms. On the 14th of October 1953, Cook, then aged 22, married Sally Levine, or Sarah as some know her, a 19-year-old waitress at the Methodist Church in Cannington. They ultimately had a large family of 7 children, 4 boys and 3 girls. In 1955, he was arrested for stealing a car and sentenced to 2 years hard labour. After his release, he took to wearing women's gloves while committing crimes in order to avoid leaving fingerprints. After marriage, Cook was arrested several times as a peeping Tom and for other minor offences. However, his minor offences were soon to quickly escalate. Eric Edgar Cook would soon go on to have a long list of victims. His victims included Gillian McPherson Brewer, 22, Brian Weir, 29, John Sturkey, 19, George Walmsley, 54, Shirley Martha Macleod, 18, Constance Lucy Madrill, 24, Patricia Venico Berkman, 33, and Rosemary Anderson, 17. As his crimes were opportunistic and used varying methods, his victims shared no obvious common traits. Predicting where he would strike and catching him was very difficult. Cook's killing spree involved a series of seemingly unrelated hit and runs, stabbings, stranglings, and shootings. Victims were shot with different rifles, stabbed with knives and scissors, as well as hit with an axe. Several were killed after waking up as Cook was robbing their homes. 2 were shot while sleeping without their homes being disturbed at all, and 1 was shot dead after answering a knock on the door. On one such occurrence, after stabbing a victim, Cook got lemonade from the refrigerator and sat on the veranda drinking it. One victim was strangled to death with the cord from a bedside lamp, after which Cook raped the corpse, dragging it to a neighbour's lawn, then sexually penetrated it with an empty whiskey bottle, which he left cradled in the victim's arms. 2 of Cook's murders resulted in false convictions. One of them, for which a man named John Button was wrongly convicted, involved Rosemary Anderson. Another was the murder of Gillian McPherson Brewer, a Melbourne heiress who was stabbed with a hatchet and scissors, which led to the false conviction of Daryl Bemish. Bemish was initially sentenced to death, but an investigation by Post newspaper's owner, Brett Christian, led to his conviction being overturned. The police case against Bemish is detailed in Christian's book, Presumed Guilty. During the 1960s, people in Australia frequently left cars unlocked and/or with the keys in the ignition, which enabled Cook to steal a car almost every night. He sometimes returned stolen vehicles without the owners becoming aware of the theft, including several cars that were involved in hit and runs. Cook's first hit and run was on Nell Schneider, 29, a mother of 4 who came to Australia from Amsterdam in September 1955. After being thrown from her bike, Schneider was left with a fractured skull and permanent brain damage. On Australia Day, 1963, Cook prowled the streets at night and shot 5 people, killing 3. He had stolen a rifle the night before from a South Perth house. These events would lead to his nickname, the Night Caller. The shootings began at 2:40 a.m. at the beachside suburb, Cottesloe, when a middle-aged couple saw a man lurking across the road from their parked car. The man yelled at him to clear off and reportedly threw a beer bottle. The woman told police that she saw the prowler raise a .22 rifle and take aim from around 12 metres away. The woman shoved her companion's head down and a bullet went through her hand and through his neck. he managed to drive to Fremantle Hospital for help. Cook then stalked his way to the flat of Brian Weir, a 29-year-old accountant who was sleeping with his head facing the open veranda door. Cook took aim and shot Mr. Weir, who was operated on by brain surgeons for more than 6 hours. A fit lifesaver, Mr. Weir was left permanently disabled. Retired grocer George Walmsley, 55, was shot in the head as he answered the door to Cook. Mr. Walmsley, his wife, and 21-year-old daughter were awoken by Cook, who rang the doorbell of their Nedlands home at about 3 a.m. His wife and daughter found him unconscious at the front door with a bullet wound in the centre of his forehead. The next victim of Cook's rampage was 19-year-old John Sturkey, an agricultural science student and Queen Scout, who was shot as he slept on the veranda of his boarding house. A fellow lodger, reported as Pauline Fenton, called police after she awoke to the sound of Mr. Sturkey's moans. Miss Fenton told police she thought her housemate was having a bad dream. The city was in fear. Police urged residents to lock their doors and cars as they searched for the gunman. Weeks later, he was responsible for the strangulation murder of social worker Constance Madrill, 24, in February 1963, just a few weeks after his shooting spree. On August 18, 18-year-old student Shirley Macleod was killed by a single shot to the head while she was babysitting at Dalkeith. The police investigation included fingerprinting more than 30,000 males over the age of 12, as well as locating and test firing more than 60,000 .22 rifles. After a rifle was found hidden in a bush on Rookwood Street, Mount Pleasant, in August 1963, ballistic tests proved the gun to have been used in the murder of Shirley Macleod. Police returned to the location and tied a similar rifle, rendered inoperable, to the bush with fishing line and constructed a hide in which they waited in case someone returned for it. Cook was apprehended when he returned to collect the weapon 17 days later. He confessed to many crimes, including 8 murders and 14 attempted murders. He was convicted on a charge of murdering John Lindsay Sturkey, one of Cook's 5 Australia Day shooting victims. In his confessions, Cook demonstrated an exceptionally good memory for the details of his crimes, irrespective of how long ago he had committed the offences. For example, he confessed to more than 250 burglaries and was able to detail exactly what he took, including the number and denominations of the coins he had stolen from each location. The book, Presumed Guilty, includes Cook's confessions, made over 2 days in September 1963 at Fremantle Prison to his legal aid lawyer, Desmond Heenan. Quote, "I have great respect for the law, although my actions don't show this." Cook pleaded not guilty on the grounds of insanity. At trial, Cook's lawyers claimed that he suffered from schizophrenia, but this claim was dismissed after the director of the State Mental Health Services testified that he was sane. The state would not allow independent psychiatric specialists to examine Cook. Cook was convicted of willful murder on the 28th of November 1963 after a 3-day trial by jury in the Supreme Court of Western Australia. He was sentenced to death by hanging, and despite having grounds to appeal, he ordered his lawyers not to apply, claiming that he deserved to pay for what he had done. After 13 months in U Division, Cook was hanged at 8 a.m. on the 26th of October 1964 in Fremantle Prison. 10 minutes before the sentence was carried out, Cook swore on the Bible that he had killed Gillian Brewer and Rosemary Anderson, claims which had been previously rejected as others had already been convicted of those murders. Cook was the last person to be hanged in the state of Western Australia. He was buried in Fremantle Cemetery above the remains of child killer Martha Rendell. Through the 19th and 20th century, extensive public records exist of the various killers that have plagued the quiet city of Perth, Western Australia. Although one of the most remote cities on Earth, or maybe even because it's exactly that, so remote. No less than 4 serial killers and suspected serial killers have chosen Perth as their hunting ground in recent decades. But we'll look into that another time. So there you go, just a brief little outro. Thanks for tuning in, guys and girls. I had crazy fun researching about Perth. I just did this little episode because I've grown up in Perth most of my adult life and wasn't aware of a lot of the stuff that had gone on. A lot of crazy shit in the history of it. Same with a lot of towns. We might do, if you have the idea of something that happened near you want to send it in, go to carouselsnipervictim.com or deadglassdesign.com or on Facebook or Twitters or Instagram, whatever. Shoot us through a message and let us know and we might be able to cover it. Next episode, we're going to actually go out, me and Jack, to Fremantle Prison and Fremantle Cemetery, and we're going to walk around and visit Plot 409, where Martha Rendell and Eric Edgar Cook were both buried, as well as there's some other things there. There's the Australian National Monument, which is John Bon Scott's grave from AC/DC, and there's a bunch of other crazy shit there as well. But yeah, so we'll do a live episode out from the field, maybe even try and interview some of the historians and shit that are out there and get some of their takes on the craziness, see if anyone that actually works there today actually knows any of the history of it, be like, do you know who's buried here? But yeah, anyway, cheers for everyone for listening, and go check out deadglassdesign.com, and yeah, catch you next time. Later, yo.
Officer has engaged suspect vehicle in pursuit. Confirmed. Pursuit engaged. All units be advised we have a pursuit in
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
Stand by to assist.